Along with the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division since just after 8 o'clock last night local time, noon on the East Coast, 9 a.m. on the West Coast. But so far it's been a long experience as they're trekking along here through the desert. I want my photographer Craig White to pan over here. This is just part of the convoy that has stopped right now for refueling. They've been refueling. This is the first time that they've stopped for refueling. Basically, this division is what they call the Iron Fist. It's got a heavily armored, it's the only tank brigade in the Persian Gulf region for the Americans. So this is the most heavily armored force that the Americans have. 250 Abrams tanks roughly, hundreds of Bradley fighting vehicles, more than 1,000 infantrymen, ready to roll toward Baghdad, and that's essentially where we've been going, is heading north toward Baghdad on the route out of Kuwait. We've seen a number of things along the way of interest. Certainly at first we went through the Iraqi minefields. Those were lined with the night glow sticks that allowed us to pass through those minefields. But once we cleared out of those minefields, we saw some other things which are of note. We saw unexploded ordnance from the first Persian Gulf War. What these soldiers are calling Gulf I, they're now calling this Gulf II. But from that first Persian Gulf War, we saw destroyed Iraqi tanks and destroyed Iraqi armored personnel carriers, but also from the American munitions which were fired upon those, unexploded cluster bombs. So as they've been traveling along this route, which they're calling Route Hurricane, because they like to think of themselves as that large moving object heading straight toward Baghdad, but as they've been traveling along this route, and it's not a dirt road, it's not much more than just a trek in the sand. As a matter of fact, if I ask Craig to pan off to the north here, you can see the route that we're taking, which is basically just out over the horizon toward the north, but it's also, as you can see, there's no road there, it's just making your way through the sand. We've also seen some other interesting things. We've seen some Bedouin communities along the way, women and children and some men out waving to the soldiers as they go by, young children, women who are just going about their tasks. I mean, these are people who live as nomads essentially out in the southern Iraqi desert, but as the American troops have rolled on, they wave to them as we head north. They've encountered very, very light opposition. It was only at the 2 initial Iraqi observation posts that they encountered some opposition, which they quickly destroyed, they tell us. Other than that, it's been smooth sailing. The road's bumpy, some vehicles are breaking down. They have to have the fuel trucks keep up to refuel and reload and keep moving north. But so far, for this huge division, 20,000 soldiers, it's been smooth sailing.
After the onslaught came the eerie sound of silence. Many streets were still deserted, but those who chose to venture out spent the night picking through the remains of buildings now reduced to rubble. Those left still standing were also left to burn. The aftermath of the attack was all too plain to see, and the Iraqis were keen to allow camera crews in to what they say is a damaged palace compound. It's still too early for independent observers to assess the accuracy of the bombardments, but so far it's been reported that 3 top Iraqi commanders may have been killed. The Pentagon insists the buildings picked out for bombing are either military or key government installations, or some where Saddam Hussein and those closest to him may just be sheltering. Dramatic pictures have also been released of an Iraqi military briefing, which was taking place in Baghdad while the bombs were dropping. An official was describing Allied troop advances when the explosion started. The Iraqi defense minister continued the briefing while the walls shook from Allied bombing and the anti-aircraft fire.
The confusion of Iraqi officials is growing. Their ability to see what is happening on the battlefield, to communicate with their forces, and to control their country is slipping away. They're beginning to realize, I suspect, that the regime is history. And as that realization sets in, their behavior is likely to begin to tip and to change. Weapons that are being used today have a degree of precision that no one ever dreamt of in a prior conflict. They didn't exist. And it's not a handful of weapons, it's the overwhelming majority of the weapons that have that precision.
Iraq has now given an immediate reaction to the bombardment and has accused the United Nations of helping the US in this war.
I would like to warn that the deep crisis facing the United Nations today, due to the American-British invasion of Iraq, and the failure of the United Nations in keeping the collective peace system based on the principles of the Charter will deepen even further if the Secretariat General of the United Nations did not take appropriate measures to follow to the letter the implementation of Article 100 of the Charter.
At around 2 o'clock this morning, the skies over Gloucestershire echoed once again to the sound of B-52 bombers as they returned to their base at RAF Fairford, having completed their first mission in this conflict. A total of 8 aircraft were sent out yesterday morning to unleash their power on the Iraqi capital, but now they're back at their British base, awaiting their next orders. The land invasion of Iraq is now also well underway, and British and American troops have pushed forward to secure key oil installations and to prevent Iraqi troops setting them alight, creating an environmental disaster. Allied forces have taken Iraq's biggest port, Qazar, as Iraqi troops surrender in the south of the country. US defense officials have also reported this morning that the commander of Iraq's 51st Division has surrendered to American Marines advancing through the desert towards Baghdad. If the reports are confirmed, it would be the first time that the commander of an Iraqi division has surrendered to US and British forces. Chris Howes, ITV News.
In my judgment, what they do is to facilitate the refueling operations. For the aircraft taking off from the bases to the west, it provides some intermediate point between those launching platforms, the targets, and return. In the absence of the use of the Turkish bases, H2 and H3 loom very, very large. Further, and I'll just put a circle around this belt now on the telestrator, during Desert Storm, those were the Scud launching platforms, the so-called Scud box, that so bedeviled the coalition in 1991. Having coalition forces there will certainly facilitate the anti-Scud campaign.
It was hit. Now, there were attacks during daylight hours, which will have surprised a lot of the Baghdad population there. Of course, the last 3 nights they've been bombarded, but always under cover of darkness. These attacks took place at about 11:45 our time, 2:45 their time. And there were about 6 or 7 explosions that were reported, at least that's what our correspondent Raghi Omar said, on the outskirts of the city. The Iraqis claiming that overnight 200 people have been injured by the very heavy bombardment that you saw taking place. And the Iraqis also saying that 3 people have been killed in those attacks. It's all, we understand, quiet at the moment in Baghdad, but those were the explosions that took place a short time ago during daylight hours.
It's really a testimony, isn't it, to the resilience of the people of Baghdad, going out, driving around town under that very threatening black cloud and possibly fearing other attacks.
Well, there's the pictures we had in a few moments ago. This is now the live scene in Baghdad, and as you can see, thick black plumes of smoke hanging over the city. 6 or 7 explosions, that's what we were told, on the outskirts of the city. Raghi Omar, who's fairly near the centre, saying that he thought the explosions were about 2 or 3 miles outside the city. But still, as you can see, traffic on the streets, and this morning at least, Baghdad, there are quite a lot of people back on the streets who come out of their bunkers overnight.
It's a key crossing point on the River Euphrates and is about 200 miles from Baghdad.
The Ministry of Defense said that humanitarian aid would start moving into Iraq through the southeastern Iraqi port of Qasr, where British and American forces still face pockets of Iraqi resistance, as soon as minesweeping was completed.
Thousands of Iraqi soldiers have surrendered in southern Iraq. Many troops have already laid down their weapons, and the Pentagon's hoping for further defections. British troops have begun building several camps to process what are expected to be thousands of prisoners of war.
Iraq says 3 people have died and more than 200 civilians have been wounded in Baghdad after a massive overnight bombardment. British and American warplanes have flown around 1,000 missions across the country, and American officials say more than 3,000 missiles were fired overnight.
All 7 crew members have died on board 2 Royal Navy helicopters that collided over international waters in the Gulf. 6 of those who died were British, the 7th was American. One of the Sea King helicopters was heading out on a mission after refueling aboard HMS Ark Royal, and the other was returning to the ship.
Mid-air at around 1:30 this morning. They had been flying over international waters. On board, 6 British aircrew and 1 US Navy officer. Military commanders have described it as a tragic accident.
They've been operating in arduous conditions day in, day out for weeks on end now, providing essential support, surveillance support that is, to Royal Marines occupying the Al-Faw Peninsula at the moment, and support to me as in my role as a maritime commander here at sea in the Northern Gulf. And so a huge loss.
The helicopters were stationed on the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. One of the aircraft was heading out on its mission after refueling on board. The other helicopter was returning to the ship. Ministry of Defence officials have now confirmed that all 7 crew members have died. Speaking at a press conference in London this morning, the Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon said an investigation had been launched into the accident.
Our priority at this time is to notify the next of kin at the earliest opportunity. The cause of the accident is being investigated, and although this will be of no comfort to the families concerned, the crash is not believed to be the result of enemy action.
All the 6 British men on board were based at the Royal Naval Air Station at Caldrose in Cornwall. Laini Malkhani, BBC News.
We're on the move now. We were outside near Basra. Now the Marines that were protecting an oil facility there have been given orders to head out and move on. And you're looking at what is a military traffic jam on the highway here. 2 convoys actually moving parallel with each other. You've got the British that are in the light tan color, and then you also have in the green here the U.S. forces, but the roadways here have become clogged with military vehicles, and it just shows you the force that continues to arrive here. Jim?
All right, Martin, I'm going to have to break it off there. We're going to find out a military update from the top military man in charge of this operation, General Tommy Franks.
As a last resort, we must be willing to use military force. We are willing, and we're using military force. I'm pleased to be joined today by Air Marshal Brian Burridge, Great Britain, Brigadier Murray McNarn of Australia, Rear Admiral Per T. Demond from Denmark, Lieutenant Colonel Jan Blom from the Netherlands. 4 coalition partners represented here with us, and as many of you would know, we have at our home in Tampa, Florida, the home of Central Command, 52 nations represented. What many of you may not know is that many of these nations are also represented in the command posts of our component commands located in a number of countries in the region. You know, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, my boss, yesterday outlined the military objectives of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Let me review them with you. First, end the regime of Saddam Hussein. Second, to identify, isolate, and eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Third, to search for, to capture, and to drive out terrorists from that country. Fourth, to collect such intelligence as we can related to terrorist networks. Fifth, to collect such intelligence as we can related to the global network of illicit weapons of mass destruction. Sixth, to end sanctions and to immediately deliver humanitarian support to the displaced and to many needy Iraqi citizens. Seventh, to secure Iraq's oil fields and resources, which belong to the Iraqi people. And last, to help the Iraqi people create conditions for a transition to a representative self-government. Today, I thought I would describe the campaign you're seeing and provide you an operational update. Let me begin by saying this will be a campaign unlike any other in history. A campaign characterized by shock, by surprise, by flexibility, by the employment of precise munitions on a scale never before seen, and by the application of overwhelming force. Let me talk for a minute about our capabilities. The coalition now engaged in and supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom includes Army and Marine forces from the land component, air forces from several nations, naval forces to include the Coast Guard, and special operations forces. Our plan introduces these forces across the breadth and depth of Iraq, in some cases simultaneously, and in some cases sequentially. In some cases, our special operations forces support conventional ground forces. Examples of this include operations behind enemy lines to attack enemy positions and formations, or perhaps to secure bridges and crossing sites over rivers, or perhaps to secure key installations like the gas oil platforms, and of course in some cases to adjust air power, as we saw in Afghanistan. Now in some cases our air forces support ground elements or support special operations forces by providing fires and intelligence information, perhaps offensive electronic warfare capabilities. At other times, coalition airmen deliver decisive, precision shock, such as you witnessed beginning last night. At certain points, special operations forces and ground units support air forces by pushing enemy formations into positions to be destroyed by air power. And in yet other cases, our naval elements support air, support ground operations, or support special operations forces by providing aircraft, cruise missiles, or by conducting maritime operations or mine-clearing operations. And so the plan we see uses combinations of these capabilities that I've just described. It uses them at times and in places of our choosing in order to accomplish the objectives I mentioned just a moment ago. That plan gives commanders at all levels, and it gives me latitude to build the mosaic that I just described in a way that provides flexibility so that we can attack the enemy on our terms, and we are doing so. And now a bit on what you've seen over the last now less than 72 hours. The initiation of combat operations. We refer to that as D-Day. The introduction of special operations forces. We refer to that as S-Day. The introduction of ground forces, G-Day. And the introduction of shock air forces, A-Day. Additionally, a number of emerging targets have been struck along the way and will continue to be struck as they emerge. So the sequence you have seen up to this point has been S-G-A. That sequence was based on our intelligence reads, how we see the enemy, and on our sense of the capabilities of our own forces. In a few minutes, Brigadier General Vince Brooks, one of our operations officers, will provide a number of visuals which reflect operations up to this point. In the days ahead, you will see evidence of the truth of Secretary Rumsfeld's statement yesterday when he said Saddam Hussein was given a choice by the international community to give up his weapons of mass destruction or lose power. He chose unwisely, and now he will lose both. Let me introduce General Vince Brooks to give you a little bit of an idea of what operations over the last 3 days have looked like. Vince?
Thank you, sir, very much. And ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to take a few minutes to brief you now on something that began on the 19th of March, and since that time, coalition forces have already achieved a number of several key mission objectives. Our first effort is aggressive and direct attacks to disrupt the regime's key command, control, communications, integrated air defense, and ballistic missiles using very precise targeting and methods that will achieve the desired effects. This video shows an attack against an Ababil 100 in southern Iraq and resulted in its destruction. Our second focus is on special operations. Coalition Special Operations Forces entered Iraq at night after destroying Iraqi military outposts, as this short video shows. You will see two clips. The first is an outpost along the border, and the second is a building that supported observers on the border. The Special Operations Forces then began looking for Saddam Hussein's and the regime's weapons of mass destruction and their ballistic missiles that threaten their neighbors. Additionally, Coalition Special Operations Forces saved 3 key oil terminals that are used for export through the Gulf. And these terminals are key to the future of Iraq. By preventing certain destruction, the coalition has preserved the future of Iraq. This is the area where the 3 terminals were in southern Iraq and in the Arabian Gulf. On these platforms, we found a variety of things. We found weapons, ammunition, and explosives. These explosives are not meant for defenders. Our coalition maritime forces have destroyed the Iraqi naval forces, as the following video shows. Now, this is a patrol boat being attacked from the air, and in a moment you'll see the secondary explosion completing its destruction. It will come in this image here. They're also very active in ensuring that the waterways remain open and unmined so that Iraq is not cut off from the aid that is prepared to flow in. What you see in the next image is a tugboat that appears to be carrying oil drums. In fact, it is a mining vessel that transports mines. Interdictions like this one done by our coalition maritime forces and others over the last 2 days prevented for sure the release of 139 floating mines into the Khar Abdullah, which is an inlet that joins the Iraqi inland waterways with the Arabian Gulf. Ground maneuver forces attacked to seize the key Rumaila oil fields and simultaneously began an unprecedented combined arms penetration deep into Iraq. The attack continues as we speak and has already moved the distance of the longest maneuver in the 1991 Gulf War in 1/4 of the time. The oil fields were spared destruction that was intended by the regime because of the effectiveness of these attacks. In the next image, you'll see wells that were set afire on the 19th in the afternoon before the coalition attack began. By the next day, the land component had already entered Iraq and prevented any further destruction. And this is video from the entering forces. And the good news is only 9 of the roughly 500 oil wells that are in the Rumaila oil field, only 9 were sabotaged by the regime. The flame on the bottom shows where that location is. All the rest of them are okay. I should add that the power of information has been key throughout this operation, and it is truly having the effect of saving lives of the Iraqi people and military units who are choosing not to fight and die for a doomed regime. Leaders from several regular Army divisions surrendered to coalition forces, and their units abandoned their equipment and returned to their homes, just as the coalition had instructed. We know that there are other forces on the battlefield that we haven't even arrived at yet, and as this next image shows, there are Iraqi units that are preparing to surrender, even now as we speak. These are lines of roughly 700 Iraqi soldiers that we've imaged in the desert, away from their equipment, awaiting our arrival. The coalition is committed to disarming Iraq, but the coalition is equally committed to bringing humanitarian assistance to the Iraqi people. Our humanitarian work in Iraq is only beginning. The U.S. military, coalition partners, and other civilian organizations from around the world have positioned millions of meals, medicines, and other supplies for the Iraqi people. This image shows some of the stocks of humanitarian daily rations that we are already preparing to push forward as they're required. Our coalition forces will continue to coordinate closely with a broad array of organizations and ensure that as much aid as is possible can be provided to the Iraqi people when it is required and where it is required. Sir?
Thanks, Vince. So as we speak, our forces are operating inside Iraq. We have operations ongoing in the north, in the west, in the south, in and around Baghdad. Our troops are performing as we would expect, magnificently. And indeed, the outcome is not in doubt. There may well be tough days ahead, but the forces on the field will achieve the objectives that have been set out by the governments of this coalition.
Hearing coalition forces report substantial gains on the ground in the south as thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrender. In Baghdad, there are still intermittent explosions after last night's huge bombardment. So, coalition troops are now in Basra, Iraq's second city. US forces are advancing on Baghdad after capturing a key town on the Euphrates River. Thousands of Iraqi troops have surrendered, including, we're told, some senior officers. Turkish troops are said to be in northern Iraq. Meanwhile, military experts carry out bomb damage assessment following last night's raids on Baghdad. Now, the Defense Secretary Jeff Hoon gave a bullish account of the invasion so far, saying the operation is going according to plan, and in many respects, he said, is ahead of the plan. In the Iraqi capital today, large plumes of smoke twisted into the sky, the result apparently of the Iraqis themselves setting fire to huge pools of oil as a defensive measure. There have been daylight raids for the first time, and Iraq claims 3 people have died. Among coalition losses, early this morning, 2 Royal Navy helicopters crashed, killing 6 British servicemen and 1 American. There's still some resistance in the oil port of Qasr, where Royal Marines have been fighting. Coalition forces have entered Basra, and many Iraqi soldiers there are believed to have surrendered. US troops have also captured Nasiriyah, securing a vital bridge over the Euphrates River, which is on the road to Baghdad. And in the capital, where B-52 bombers led last night's heavy aerial assault, the US says only precise bombs and missiles were used. Despite Iraqi claims that more than 200 civilians were injured, the targets are believed to have included presidential palaces, the TV station, and indeed the Ministry of Defense. While coalition military leaders are promising this war will be conducted on a scale never seen before across the whole breadth and depth of Iraq, it will, they say, be a campaign unlike any other in history.